The funeral for my husband, Arthur, was the quietest day of my existence. I stood there, a 8-year-old woman named Eleanor Vance, feeling like a hollowed-out tree, the wind whistling through the space where my heart used to be. The cold Montana air bit at my cheeks, but I felt nothing. There, beside the freshly dug grave, as the handful of mourners offered their empty condolences, my phone vibrated in the pocket of my black coat. A message from an unknown number. I pulled it out, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The words on the screen sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the weather. "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket." My world, already tilted on its axis, began to spin. I fumbled a reply, my fingers stiff and clumsy. "Who are you?" The response came almost immediately, and it stole the breath from my lungs. "I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons." That single moment tore my soul in two. I looked up from the phone, my gaze landing on Richard and Mark, my own sons, standing by the polished mahogany casket. Their expressions were strangely calm. Something was terribly wrong. Their tears, when they came, seemed forced. Their hugs, when they offered them, were as cold as the ice on the Yellowstone River. For 42 years, Arthur had been my partner, my refuge, my reason for living. I met him when I was 24, right here in the small, dusty town of Cedar River. We grew up on the same forgotten back roads, sharing modest dreams. I was cleaning houses to support my sick mother, and Arthur was fixing furniture in a small woodworking shop he'd inherited from his father. We were poor, but we were happy. We had something money couldn't buy: real, uncomplicated love. I remember the first time he spoke to me. It was a Tuesday morning. I was walking toward the market in my faded green dress, my shoes worn thin. He stepped out of his shop, his hands stained with wood varnish, and smiled at me with a shyness that made my heart leap. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, his voice soft. "That's a beautiful dress." I'd bought it for $1 at the church sale, but in that moment, I felt like a queen. That conversation turned into dates under the big old oak tree in Town Square Park, then into promises of eternal love, and finally into a simple wedding full of hope. The first few years were hard. We lived in a 2-bedroom house with a tin roof. When it rained, we'd set out pots all over the house to catch the leaks, laughing as we did it. But we were happy. Arthur worked from sunup to sundown in his shop, the scent of pine and sawdust clinging to him like a second skin. I sewed clothes for the women in town, my fingers often sore, but my spirit full. When Richard was born, I thought my heart would burst with happiness. He was a beautiful baby with his father's big, thoughtful eyes and my smile. 2 years later, Mark arrived, just as perfect. I raised them with all the love in the world, sacrificing my own needs for theirs, and I did so gladly. Arthur was a wonderful father. He'd take them fishing in the river on Sundays, teach them to fix things with their hands, and tell them stories before bed. I fed them, dressed them, and comforted them when they cried. We were a close family, woven together by love and shared struggle, or so I believed. As they grew up, things started to change. Richard, the oldest, was always ambitious. From a young age, he'd ask why we lived so modestly, why we didn't have a new car like other families. Mark, eager for his older brother's approval, followed his lead in everything. When Richard turned 18, Arthur offered him a place at the shop, a chance to learn the trade, to build something real. Richard rejected it with a contempt that stung. "I don't want to get my hands dirty like you, Dad," he'd said, not looking his father in the eye. "I'm going to be someone important." Those words hurt Arthur deeply, though he never said it to me. I'd see him sitting on the porch at night, long after I'd gone to bed, just staring at the stars with a look of profound sadness. His son had rejected not only his work, but his entire way of life, his values, his very essence. The years passed, and to my surprise, Richard made a name for himself. He got a job at a real estate company in Bozeman, and his ambition proved sharp. He had a knack for it. Mark followed him soon after. They both started making money, far more than Arthur and I had ever seen. At first I was so proud. My sons had achieved what we never could, escaping the grip of poverty and building a better life. But little by little, that joy turned into sadness. The visits became less frequent. the phone calls shorter. When they did come, they arrived in expensive cars, dressed in fancy suits, talking about investments, portfolios, and properties. They'd look at our little house, the one with the leaking roof we'd patched 100 times, with a strange mix of pity and shame. "Mom," Richard said to me during one of their sporadic visits, "you and Dad should move somewhere better. This house is falling apart. It's an embarrassment." He was right, in a way. The house was old, but it held all our memories. It was where we'd raised them, where we'd shared thousands of meals, where we'd grown old together. It wasn't fancy, but it was our home. Arthur, always wise, would tell me, "Eleanor, money has changed our boys. We aren't enough for them anymore." I resisted believing it. I kept justifying their absences, their brief calls, their broken promises. They're busy building their lives. I'd tell myself, someday they'll be the loving boys we raised again. But in my heart, I knew Arthur was right. We had lost our sons long before I lost my husband. I just didn't know to what extent we had become strangers to them. The most drastic change came when Richard married Sophia Albright, a woman from the city who never hid her disdain for our simple lifestyle. The first time he brought her home, she arrived in high heels that sank into the dirt of our path and an elegant red dress that looked more expensive than everything I had ever owned. "Nice to meet you," she said with a forced smile, barely extending the tips of her fingers to greet me. Her eyes scanned our humble home with an expression I couldn't decipher, but that made me feel small. During dinner, Sophia barely touched the food I had prepared with so much love, the pot roast that had taken me all day. She moved it around on her plate, cutting tiny pieces, but she ate almost nothing. Richard seemed nervous, constantly apologizing for things he had never been ashamed of before. "Next time, we'll take them out to a real restaurant," he whispered to Sophia, thinking I couldn't hear, but I heard him. Every word pierced my heart like a shard of glass. Mark, for his part, remained single but adopted the same distant attitude as his brother. His visits were limited to special occasions, and even then, he always seemed to be in a hurry to leave. He was constantly on his phone, closing deals, even during our conversations. "Mom, I have to go," he'd always say. "I have an important meeting early tomorrow." Family Sundays became a distant memory. Christmases grew cold and formal. My sons would bring expensive, impersonal gifts. We didn't need a complicated espresso machine for a woman who loved her percolator, a cashmere throw for a man who was happy with his old quilt. They'd stay for 2 or 3 hours and then leave with evident relief. Arthur and I grew old alone, comforting each other. He continued to work in his shop, though his hands, gnarled with arthritis, no longer had the same strength. I continued with my sewing, though my eyes weren't the same. We made do with our small income, proud not to ask for anything from our successful sons. "Do you know what the saddest part is, Eleanor?" Arthur said to me one night as we drank coffee on the porch. "It's not that they have money, it's that the money has made them believe we aren't important anymore." He was right, as always. My sons hadn't just changed financially, they had changed in their hearts. We were no longer their beloved parents. We were an uncomfortable reminder of a past they wanted to forget. Things got worse when Richard bought a $500,000 house in an exclusive neighborhood in Bozeman. Mark did the same soon after, investing in a luxury condo that cost $350,000. Suddenly, our sons were owners of fortunes we couldn't even imagine. "You should sell this house and move into a retirement community," Sophia suggested during one of her rare visits. "There are some very nice places for people your age. You'd be more comfortable." The word community hit me like a slap. A home. After 42 years of building our home, after raising these sons with so much love, they wanted to send us to a home. "We don't need a home," Arthur replied with the quiet dignity that always characterized him. "We're fine here, in our house." But I saw the expression on Richard's and Mark's faces. They supported Sophia's idea. To them, we were a burden, a problem to be solved in the most convenient way. It was then that the more direct suggestions began. Richard arrived one day with papers in his hand, documents he had prepared without consulting us. "Dad, Mom," he said with that fake, polished smile he had perfected. "I've been thinking about your future. This house. It's worth about $150,000, given the land. If you sell it, I can add some money, and you can move somewhere better. A better place. To us, there was no place better than the home where we had been happy for decades, but Richard didn't understand that. For him, everything came down to numbers. Besides, he continued, I think Dad should retire from the shop. He's 72 years old. It's time to rest. Arthur looked at him with infinite sadness. Son, working isn't a burden for me. It's what keeps me alive. It gives meaning to my days. But you could get hurt, Mark insisted, backing up his brother, as he always did. At your age, an accident would be very dangerous. Their words sounded caring, but I sensed something more behind them, an impatience, an urgency I couldn't fully grasp. The following months were tense. My sons increased the pressure for us to sell the house. They brought real estate agents without telling us. They had it appraised without our permission. They even began to talk about what would be best for everyone. But best for everyone. Look, Richard said to us during one particularly uncomfortable dinner, Sophia and I have decided to have kids soon. We'll need help with the expenses. If you sell the house and move to a smaller place, that money, it could be an early inheritance. An early inheritance? He was asking for our inheritance while we were still alive. The audacity of the request left me speechless. Arthur remained calm, but I saw his jaw tense. Son, when your mother and I die, everything we have will be yours, but while we're alive, our decisions are our own. Don't be stubborn, Dad, Mark cut in, with a harshness I had never seen from him before. You're old now. You can't keep living in the past. That night after they left, Arthur and I stayed up talking until dawn. For the first time in our marriage, we discussed the possibility that our sons were not the people we thought we had raised. Something's wrong, Eleanor, my husband said to me, with a look of worry I had never seen in his eyes. This isn't just ambition or impatience. There's something darker behind all this pressure. I had no idea how profoundly correct his words were. I couldn't imagine that my own sons were planning something that would change our lives forever. I didn't know that the tragedy that was coming wouldn't be an accident of fate, but a conspiracy carefully orchestrated by the two people I trusted most in the world. The last normal conversation I had with Richard was 3 weeks before Arthur's death. He came alone, without Sophia, and looked more serious than usual. Mom, he said, sitting at the kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast so many times as a boy. I want you to know that no matter what happens, Mark and I will always take care of you. His words soothed me at the time. But now, remembering them beside Arthur's grave, they sent a shiver down my spine. Why did he say, no matter what happens? What did he know that I didn't? The accident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning. Arthur had left early for the shop, as he had done every day for more than 40 years. I was in the kitchen preparing his favorite lunch meatloaf and mashed potatoes when the phone rang with an urgency that sent a chill through me. Mrs. Vance? A voice I didn't know asked. I'm calling from Cedar River Memorial. Your husband has been in a serious accident. You need to come immediately. The words blurred in my mind like ink in water. The world stopped. My legs turned to jelly, and I had to grab the door frame to keep from falling. What happened? Is he okay? Is he alive? Ma'am, please come as soon as possible. The trip to the hospital was a hazy nightmare. My neighbor, Doris, had to drive me because I was shaking so much I couldn't even hold the keys. The whole way there, my mind refused to process what was happening. Arthur was careful, meticulous in his work. How could this have happened? When we got to the hospital, Richard and Mark were already there. That surprised me. No one had notified them yet, at least not me. But in my desperation, I didn't pay attention to that detail. Mom, Richard said, hugging me with a force that seemed genuine. Dad is in bad shape. The doctors say one of the machines at the shop, a planer. It exploded. He has severe burns and a traumatic brain injury. Mark's eyes were red, but something in his expression felt off. He seemed more nervous than sad, like someone waiting for important news rather than someone suffering for his father. Can we see him? I asked, desperate. Only immediate family, one at a time, and for 5 minutes max, the nurse explained. When I entered that ICU room, my heart sank. Arthur was hooked up to a dozen machines, with bandages covering most of his face and arms. I barely recognized him. His breathing was labored, artificial, kept going by machines that beeped constantly. I walked up to his bed and took his hand, the only part of his body that seemed intact. "Arthur, my love, I'm here. Everything is going to be all right. You're going to recover, just like you always do." For a moment, I felt a slight squeeze in my hand. His eyes moved behind his closed lids. He was fighting. My warrior was fighting to get back to me. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I practically lived at the hospital, sleeping in the uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room. Richard and Mark took turns accompanying me, but they always seemed more interested in talking to the doctors than in comforting their father. I overheard fragmented conversations that I couldn't fully understand at the time. Mark asked about medical insurance, about the cost of treatment. Richard was on the phone, talking about life insurance policies and beneficiaries. "Mom," Richard said to me on the second day, "we reviewed Dad's insurance. He has a life insurance policy for $500,000. There's also a business policy that could cover up to $250,000 more." Why was he talking to me about money when Arthur was still fighting for his life? "I don't care about the money," I responded harshly. "I just want your dad to get better." "Of course, Mom," he said, but I saw something in his eyes that I didn't like. A coldness, a calculator working while his father lay dying. On the third day, the doctors gave us the most devastating news of my life. Dr. Patterson, an older man with a compassionate expression, gathered us in a small office. "Mrs. Vance," he began softly, "your husband's condition is critical. The burns have become infected, and the head trauma is more severe than we initially thought. We have to be realistic about his chances." "What does that mean?" I asked, though my heart already knew the answer. "It means we need to prepare for the worst. Your husband is in an induced coma. We could keep him alive indefinitely, but his quality of life, well, it's highly unlikely he will ever regain consciousness." My world fell apart around me. "We want to try everything," I said through sobs, "no matter the cost, no matter how long it takes." But Richard exchanged a look with Mark that deeply unsettled me. "Mom," Richard said, in a voice that tried to sound understanding, "we have to be practical. Dad wouldn't want to live like this. He always said he never wanted to be a burden on anyone." A burden. I exploded with a fury I didn't know I had. "He's your father. He's not a burden. He's the man who raised you, who worked his whole life to give you the best he could." "We know, Mom," Mark chimed in, "but we also have to think about you. The medical bills are going to be enormous. They could wipe out all your savings." Again, money. Always money. My husband was dying, and they were calculating costs. That night, alone in the hospital room, I took Arthur's hand and spoke to him. "My love, I don't know what to do. The doctors say there's no hope, but I can't let you go. I can't imagine my life without you." It was then that something happened that still gives me goosebumps. His fingers moved slightly, squeezing mine with a force that was almost imperceptible. His lips moved, as if he were trying to say something, but no sound came out. I called for the nurses, desperate. "He's reacting! He's trying to talk!" But by the time they arrived, Arthur had returned to his previous state. The nurse checked the monitors and shook her head. "Sometimes there are involuntary muscle spasms, ma'am. It doesn't mean he's conscious." But I knew what I had felt. Arthur had tried to communicate with me. He had fought to tell me something important. 2 days later, in the early hours of Friday morning, the machine alarms went off. Lights flashed. Nurses rushed to Arthur's room. I was dozing in the hallway when the noise woke me up. "No, no, no!" I screamed, running toward the room. The doctors worked for 40 minutes trying to resuscitate him, but it was useless. At 4:37 a.m., Arthur was officially declared dead. The pain I felt was physical, as if my heart had been ripped from my chest. Richard and Mark arrived at the hospital an hour after their father's death. They seemed prepared, as if they had been expecting the call. They brought papers, documents, and phone numbers for funeral homes. "We already talked to the Cedar River Funeral Home," Richard said to me, while I was still crying inconsolably. "They can pick up the body this morning." "We also contacted the insurance," Mark added. "The claim process is already underway." How could they be so efficient, so organized, so cold, just an hour after losing their father? Something was wrong, but my grief was so intense that I couldn't think clearly. The funeral was scheduled for the following Monday. Richard took care of all the arrangements without really consulting me. He chose the simplest casket, the shortest service, as if he wanted to get it all over with as quickly as possible. "It's what Dad would have wanted," he said. "Something simple. But Arthur deserved better than this indecent rush." The day of the funeral arrived, cloudy and cold. I wore my only black dress. Doris had to help me with the buttons. "Be strong, Eleanor," she whispered. But I didn't feel strong. I felt empty. When we got to the cemetery, I was surprised by how few people had attended. It was only Richard, Mark, Sophia, Doris, me, and the pastor. "Where are the guys from the shop?" I asked Richard. "We didn't want to bother anyone," he replied quickly. "Dad was a private person. He would have preferred something intimate." But that wasn't true. Arthur loved his community. Why had Richard made everything so secretive? During the service, I watched my sons. Richard had a solemn expression, but his eyes constantly darted toward his watch. Mark seemed restless. Sophia discreetly checked her phone behind her black veil. When it was time to throw dirt on the casket, my legs refused to hold me up. It was at that exact moment, standing by my husband's grave, that my phone vibrated. A text message from an unknown number. "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket." My heart stopped. With trembling hands, I replied, "Who are you?" The answer came immediately. "I can't say. They're watching. Don't trust our sons." The phone fell from my hands. "Are you okay, Mom?" Richard asked, approaching. I stared at him, trying to find some clue on his face. "I'm fine," I lied, putting the phone in my purse. "I just need to go home." On the way back, I couldn't get those messages out of my head. Was it possible that someone was playing a cruel joke? Or was there really a possibility that Arthur was alive? But if he was alive, who had we buried? That night, alone in my house, which now felt like a tomb, I reviewed every detail. The accident. How had my sons gotten to the hospital so quickly? And the money. From day one, they had talked about insurance policies. I decided to check Arthur's papers. In his old wooden desk, he kept all his important documents in a metal box. I found the life insurance policy Richard had mentioned, $500,000. But there was something I didn't remember. The policy had been updated just 6 months earlier, increasing the coverage from $50,000 to $500,000. Why? Arthur had never mentioned it. I kept looking and found the business policy, $250,000 in case of accidental death on the job, $750,000 in total, a fortune, a motive. My phone vibrated again. Another message from the same unknown number. Check the bank account, see who's been moving money. This person, whoever they were, knew too much. The next day, I went to the bank. Mrs. Thompson, the manager, greeted me with sincere condolences. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry about Arthur." "Thank you. I came to check our accounts. I need to understand our financial situation." She showed me the bank statements. What I saw froze me. Over the past 3 months, large withdrawals had been made from our savings account, $5,000 in January, $10,000 in February, $15,000 in March. Money that I didn't know had been moved. "Who authorized these withdrawals?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Your husband came in person," she explained. "He said he needed the money for repairs at the shop." But I kept the household accounts. We had never talked about withdrawing $30,000 from our savings. "Do you have the signatures?" She showed me the receipts. It looked like Arthur's signature, but it was too shaky, too uncertain for his usually firm, clear script. "Mrs. Thompson?" I asked. "Did he come alone?" She thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, I think he came in with one of your sons once or twice. Richard, I think. He said he was helping his dad with the paperwork, because Arthur had trouble reading the documents without his glasses." Richard. My son had been involved in money withdrawals I didn't know about, but Arthur saw perfectly well with his glasses, which he never took off. That afternoon, another message. The insurance was their idea. They convinced Arthur he needed more protection for you. It was a trap. I could no longer deny the evidence. The increased insurance, the unauthorized withdrawals, Richard's presence, their suspicious efficiency, their coldness. But the question that terrified me was whether they had really planned Arthur's death and who was sending me these messages. The following days became a nightmare of doubt. My phone kept receiving messages. Go to Arthur's shop, look in his desk. There are things you didn't see. I decided to go. Richard had said a machine had exploded, but when I got there, I found something completely different. The shop was strangely clean, too clean. There were no burn marks, no debris, no signs of the destruction that such a serious accident should have caused. Where is the machine that exploded? I asked the silence. I looked all over. The welder, the compressor, the electric planer, all were intact. What, then, had been the cause of the accident? In Arthur's desk, I found something that sent a chill through me. A note written in his handwriting, dated 3 days before his death. Richard insists I need more insurance. He says it's for Eleanor, but something doesn't feel right. I don't trust his intentions. Below that, another. Mark brought me some papers to sign. Says they're to modernize the shop. Why all the hurry? My husband had had suspicions. He had intuited their evil intentions. I kept searching and found an envelope sealed with my name on it. I opened it with trembling hands. It was a letter from Arthur. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means something has happened to me. In recent months, I've noticed strange changes in Richard and Mark. They're too interested in our money, in the insurance, in us selling the house. Sophia is putting a lot of pressure on them. Yesterday, Richard told me I should be more concerned about my safety because at my age, any accident could be fatal. I don't know why, but those words sounded like a threat. I love you, Eleanor. If something happens to me, don't trust anyone blindly, not even our sons. The letter fell from my hands. Arthur had sensed his own death. He had seen the signs that I, blinded by maternal love, had ignored. That night, Richard came to visit. He arrived with a bottle of wine and a smile that now seemed grotesque. "Mom, I've been thinking about your future," he said, pouring himself a glass. "The insurance money. It's already in process. It'll be $750,000. "How do you know the exact amount?" I asked, feigning innocence. "Well, I helped Dad with the paperwork. He wanted to make sure you had enough money to live comfortably." A lie. "And what do you think I should do with that money?" I asked, watching his reaction. His eyes lit up. "You could buy a smaller, cozier house. Or even better, move into a nice retirement community. Mark and I could manage your money, invest it for you. We could triple that amount in a few years. Triple my money, or make it disappear into their own pockets." "Let me think about it," I said. "Of course," he said, "but not too long, for your own good." After he left, I sat in my kitchen, shaking with rage and fear. My own sons had murdered their father, and now they were planning to steal everything I had left. That night, my phone vibrated. "Tomorrow, go to the police station. Ask for the report on Arthur's accident. There are contradictions you need to know about." The next day, I went to the local police station. Sheriff Brody, who had known Arthur for years, greeted me kindly. "The report on your husband's accident?" he asked, his expression confused. "What accident, Eleanor?" "From his shop, when the machine exploded." The sheriff checked his files and shook his head. "We don't have any report of an explosion at Arthur's shop. In fact, we don't have any report of a work accident involving your husband." I felt the world sway. But my son said it was an accident at the shop. That's why he was in the hospital." "Eleanor," the sheriff said gently, "your husband arrived at the hospital on Tuesday morning, but not from a work accident. According to the medical report I have here, he arrived unconscious, with symptoms of poisoning." "Poisoning?" "Poisoning." The doctors found traces of methanol in his blood, a quantity sufficient to cause blindness, brain damage, and eventually death. The hospital should have informed you. It hadn't been an explosion. Someone had deliberately poisoned my husband. Why? Why didn't anyone tell me this? The immediate family who signed the hospital papers, your sons requested that the information be kept confidential. They said you were too emotionally fragile to handle the technical details. Charles and Henry. They had hidden the true cause of Arthur's condition, invented the story of the explosion, and manipulated everyone, including me, to cover up a murder. That afternoon, Mark came home with a bouquet of flowers. "How are you, Mom? You look tired." "I'm fine. I'm just thinking about the future." "That's good. Richard and I have been talking. We think you should sell the house soon. You need liquidity." "Henry," I said, looking him directly in the eyes, "you knew your dad didn't die from a work accident." For a fraction of a second, I saw panic in his expression, but he recovered quickly. "What are you talking about, Mom?" "I went to the police station. There's no report of an explosion." This time the panic was more evident. "Mom, you shouldn't be doing things like that. They'll confuse you. The grief is getting to you." "The grief is getting to me. Or you've been lying to me." He got up abruptly. "I think you need to rest. We'll talk when you're calmer." He left quickly, making an urgent, worried phone call from the porch. That night, I received the most revealing message yet. "They're coming together tomorrow. They're going to try to convince you that you're crazy, that grief is making you imagine things. Don't believe them, and don't take anything they offer you to eat or drink." The prediction came true. The next day, Richard and Mark arrived together, accompanied by Sophia. They had expressions of exaggerated concern and a bag of pastries. "Mom, we're so worried about you," Richard began. "The neighbors have told us you've been acting strange. Doris says you've been talking to yourself." Doris had never said that. It was another lie. "Sophia brought your favorite pastries," Mark added, "and we made special coffee." I remembered the message. Don't take anything they offer. Were they planning to poison me too? "Thank you, but I already had breakfast," I said. "But Mom," Sophia insisted, "you need to eat." "I'm fine," I repeated firmly. Richard exchanged a look with Mark. "Mom, we want to talk to you about something important. We've been consulting with some doctors about your recent behavior." "My behavior?" "Yes. The strange questions, the visits to the police station. It's normal after such a loss, but it can be dangerous. We spoke to a Dr. Albright. He says it's common for older people to develop paranoia after losing a partner." Paranoia. They were accusing me of being crazy for uncovering their lies. "I am not paranoid," I said. "I'm just asking questions I should have asked from the beginning." "What questions?" Richard challenged. "Like why there's no police report for your father's accident, like why the shop is perfectly clean if there was an explosion, like why you withdrew $30,000 from our account without telling me." The silence was deafening. "Mom," Henry finally said, "those things have simple explanations. Dad withdrew that money for repairs he wanted to do in secret as a surprise for you. He wanted to remodel the house." "And the police report?" "Not all work accidents require a report," Richard lied. "Mom," Sophia intervened, "we just want to take care of you. That's why we thought it would be best if you moved to a place with specialized medical attention, a home. And in the meantime," Mark added, "we can take care of selling the house, managing the insurance money. All those complicated things you shouldn't have to handle in your current state." There it was, the complete plan. Declare me mentally incompetent, put me in a home, and take control of all my money. "And what if I refuse?" I asked. "Mom," Richard said, his smile vanishing, "if you won't listen to reason, we'll have to take more drastic measures. We can start a legal process to have you declared mentally incompetent. We have witnesses. We have testimony from doctors who confirm you're suffering from senile paranoia." "What doctors? I haven't spoken to any doctors." "Dr. Albright already signed a preliminary report," Mark added, "based on our descriptions of your behavior." It was a direct threat. If I didn't hand over my money, they would use the legal system to steal it. "I need time to think," I said. "Of course," Sophia said, "but not too much time, for your own good." After they left, I sat in my kitchen, trembling. My own sons. That night, my phone vibrated. "Eleanor, my name is David Keene. I'm a private investigator. Arthur hired me 3 weeks before he died. He was suspicious of Richard and Mark. They poisoned him with methanol mixed in his breakfast coffee. I have audio evidence of their conversations, planning everything. Tomorrow at 3 p.m., Go to the corner cafe. Sit at the back table. I'll be there. At last, I would know who had been sending those messages, and I would have the proof I needed. I knew I didn't have much time. If I didn't act fast, I'd end up locked in a home. The war had begun, and even if I was a 8-year-old woman against 2 ruthless men, I had something they didn't: the truth. That night, for the first time since Arthur's death, I smiled. My husband had not died in vain. His caution, his instinct, his decision to hire an investigator was going to allow me to get justice. Richard and Mark had seriously underestimated their mother. The next day arrived, filled with nervousness. I dressed carefully. At 2:30 p.m., I walked toward the corner cafe. Every shadow looked suspicious. The paranoia they accused me of having was starting to feel like simple survival. I went to the back table, ordered a chamomile tea, and waited. Exactly at 3, a man in his 50s approached. He was tall, with intelligent eyes and a kind expression. He carried a brown folder. "Mrs. Vance? I'm David Keene. I'm so sorry for your loss. Arthur was a good man." He sat down. "Before I show you what I have, I need you to know that this is going to be very painful. Are you ready?" "I've been getting ready since I received your first message," I replied. David opened the folder and took out a small voice recorder. "Arthur came to see me a month ago. He was worried." He pressed the play button. Arthur's voice, so familiar and dear, filled the space. "David, I need you to know that if something happens to me, it won't be an accident. Richard and Mark have been pressuring me to increase my life insurance. Yesterday, Richard brought me papers, but when I read them, I realized there were clauses that directly benefited them." My heart sped up. The recording continued. "Mark has been asking strange questions about my daily routine, what I eat for breakfast, what time I leave. He says it's out of concern, but something worries me." David paused the recording. This was 3 weeks before his death, but I have something more recent. He played another recording, Richard's voice, on the phone. "No, we can't wait any longer. The old man is starting to get suspicious. Yesterday he asked me why I was so interested in his insurance. Yes, I already have the methanol. It works perfectly. The symptoms look like a heart attack. No, Mom won't be a problem. After Dad dies, she'll be so devastated we can do whatever we want with her." Tears began to roll down my cheeks. My own son, coldly planning his father's murder. "There's more," David said softly. "This is from the day before Arthur's death. A new recording. Mark, talking to someone. Everything's ready. Tomorrow, Richard is going to put the methanol in Dad's coffee. We told him it was a special vitamin supplement. The idiot is going to drink it. The symptoms will start with dizziness, confusion, then loss of sight, coma. The doctors will think it's a stroke. By the time they realize it's poisoning, it'll be too late." My world completely collapsed. "How did you get these recordings?" "Arthur had asked me to put listening devices in your house. He was afraid. He took out photographs. I also have this. Richard, buying methanol at a hardware store 30 miles from town. He paid with cash and used a fake name, but I have it on video. The photos clearly showed Richard leaving the store with a small bottle. And this," David continued, showing me documents. "They're financial records. Richard owes $200,000 to a lender in the city. Mark has gambling debts for $150,000. They were desperate. It all made sense. Why didn't you go to the police immediately after Arthur's death? Because they're smart. They bribed the doctor who attended to Arthur at the hospital to change the official diagnosis. Instead of poisoning, the death certificate says heart failure due to complications from a work accident. Without that medical evidence, my recordings might not have been enough." "But now we have all the evidence," I said. "Exactly. And one more thing." My blood ran cold. "Your sons were planning to kill you too." He played one last recording, Richard and Mark. "Once we have Dad's insurance money, we need to get rid of Mom too," Richard said. "We can't risk her getting suspicious." "How?" Mark asked. "The same as with Dad, but this time we can make it look like a suicide from depression. A widow who can't live without her husband. Nobody would question it. And the money, we're her only heirs. Everything would be ours. The house, the savings, the insurance money. Almost $1 million in total. The recording stopped. I was shaking uncontrollably. "Mrs. Vance," David said gently, "we have enough evidence to make them pay." "What do we do now?" "First, we go to the police. Sheriff Brody is an honest man. Second, we act fast. Your sons are planning to have you declared mentally incompetent tomorrow." I intercepted a call. "They're meeting with a judge at 10 a.m. I got up. "Then we have to act tonight." "Exactly," David confirmed. "But first, one last thing." He took out a photograph. "Arthur, leaving a medical clinic. 3 days before he died, your husband went to get a full medical exam. The results show he was perfectly healthy. No heart disease. This definitively proves his death was caused by poisoning." That was the final piece. Arthur had been a healthy man, murdered by his own sons. "David," I said, "thank you for keeping your promise to my husband. Now let's get justice." That same night, David and I went directly to the police station. Sheriff Brody was working the night shift. "Sheriff," I said, "I need to file a formal complaint for the murder of my husband, Arthur." He looked at me with surprise. "Murder? Eleanor? The death certificate says." "The death certificate is false," I replied, placing David's folder on his desk. "My husband was deliberately poisoned with methanol by our own sons." For the next 2 hours, we presented all the evidence: the audio recordings, the photos, the bank documents, Arthur's medical results, and the recordings of their plan to kill me. Sheriff Brody listened, his expression growing darker with each piece of evidence. When we finished, he shook his head in disbelief. This is monstrous." "Are you sure you want to go through with this, Eleanor? Once we arrest your sons, there's no turning back." "Sheriff," I replied, "those men murdered my husband in cold blood. They were planning to murder me, too. They are no longer my sons. They are criminals who must pay." "We'll need the medical examiner to exhume Arthur's body to confirm," the sheriff explained. "Do whatever is necessary," I replied. Sheriff Brody immediately called the district attorney. Despite the late hour, the DA came to the station. After reviewing the evidence, he authorized arrest warrants for Richard and Mark. "We'll proceed at dawn," the DA said. David walked me home. "Are you sure you'll be okay alone?" "I'll be fine," I replied. "I'm no longer afraid. I have justice on my side." I couldn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen, looking at the photographs of Arthur. For the first time since his death, I didn't feel only pain. I felt a strange satisfaction, knowing that justice was coming. At 6 a.m., my phone rang. It was Richard. "Mom, you need to come to Mark's house right away. Something terrible has happened." "What happened?" I asked, feigning concern. It's better if I explain in person. Please, come quickly." I knew it was a trap. They were moving up their plans. "I'm on my way," I lied. Instead of going, I stayed in my kitchen. At 7:30 a.m., I saw from my window as several police cars headed toward my sons' houses. My phone rang repeatedly for the next hour. First Richard, then Mark, both with increasingly desperate voices. I didn't answer. At 9 a.m., Sheriff Brody knocked on my door. "Eleanor, we've arrested Richard and Mark. They are in custody, charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder." I felt my legs tremble with relief. How did they react? Richard denied everything, but when we played the recordings, he collapsed. Mark tried to escape through the back window. We had to chase him for 6 blocks. That afternoon, Sophia came to see me. She arrived sobbing, pleading, "Eleanor, please, you have to drop the charges. Richard isn't bad. He was just desperate because of his debts. This is my fault, too. I pressured him." I looked at her without a trace of compassion. "Sophia, your husband poisoned my husband. He was planning to murder me, too. There is no explanation for that." "But we're family," she screamed. "The family died the day you decided to kill Arthur for money," I replied coldly. "Now please leave my house." Now. 3 days later, the exhumation was carried out. The lab results confirmed it. Lethal levels of methanol. The case became a sensation. No one could believe it. We also discovered the doctor who had falsified the death certificate had received $20,000 in cash from Richard. He was also arrested. David explained Arthur's plan. Your husband was smarter than they believed. He hired me not only to investigate, but to protect you. He wanted to make sure that if something happened to him, the truth would come to light. My Arthur. Even in his final days, he had been protecting me. The trial was scheduled for 2 months later. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, neighbors, everyone was there. I wore my black dress, and David sat by my side. Richard and Mark entered in handcuffs, dressed in orange prison jumpsuits. Seeing them broke my heart one more time, but I no longer felt pity. The prosecutor presented the case with devastating precision. The recordings were played. The courtroom was silent. When the prosecutor played the recording of them planning my murder, several people in the audience gasped in horror. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor said, "this is not an ordinary case of greed. This is a case of cold and calculated premeditation, where 2 men decided to murder the father who had raised them with love, simply because they needed money." When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand. "Mrs. Vance," the prosecutor asked, "can you tell us what your relationship was like with your sons?" "I thought I had a good relationship," I replied, looking directly at them. "I raised them with love. I sacrificed everything. I never imagined that love and sacrifice would become the reason for his murder." "At any point, did you suspect they could harm your husband?" "No, that is the most painful part. I trusted them completely. When they told me he had an accident, I believed them. I never imagined they were covering up a murder." Richard lowered his head. Mark looked at me defiantly, but I saw tears in his eyes. Too late for tears. The most dramatic moment came when the prosecutor played the full recording of them planning my murder. "Once we have Dad's insurance money, we need to get rid of Mom, too." A murmur of horror swept the room. "How did you feel when you heard this?" the prosecutor asked. "I realized," I said, my voice cracking but firm, "that I had lost my 2 sons long before I lost my husband. The babies I nursed, the children I comforted, had died and been replaced by 2 strangers capable of any cruelty for money." David testified. The medical examiner testified. After 3 days, the closing arguments arrived. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. "In the case of the state versus Richard and Mark Vance," the judge read, "on the charge of first-degree murder of Arthur Vance, we find the defendants guilty." The courtroom erupted. Richard collapsed. Mark remained rigid, staring ahead. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder against Eleanor Vance, we find the defendants guilty." The judge proceeded to sentencing. "For the premeditated murder of your father and the conspiracy to murder your mother, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." I felt a gigantic weight lift from my shoulders. Justice. Finally, justice for Arthur. After the trial, many people came to hug me. Doris cried with me, not from sadness, but from relief. "Eleanor, Arthur can rest in peace now." That night, I returned to my house. It was my home again. David came to visit a week later. "How do you feel?" he asked. "At peace," I answered honestly. "For the first time since Arthur's death, I sleep soundly." "And the money? The insurance?" "I donated the life insurance money to a foundation for victims of family crimes," I explained. "That money was stained with blood. I could never have used it. My personal savings are enough to live." 6 months after the trial, I received a letter from prison. It was from Richard. "Mom, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know I regret everything. The money, the debts, they blinded us. We destroyed the most loving family in the world for money we didn't even get to enjoy. I can't live with what we did." He was found in his cell the next day. Henry, upon learning of his brother's death, suffered a complete nervous breakdown and was transferred to the prison psychiatric hospital. Today, 2 years after the trial, I live peacefully in my small house. I have converted Arthur's shop into a garden where I grow flowers to take to his grave every Sunday. David has become a close friend. Sometimes the neighbors ask if I miss my sons. The answer is complicated. I miss the children they were, but those children died long before Arthur did. The men they became were not my sons. They were strangers who shared my blood but not my heart. I have learned that true family is not defined by blood, but by love, loyalty, and mutual respect. Arthur was my true family for 42 years. The friends who supported me are my family now. Justice did not bring Arthur back, but it gave me peace. And on quiet nights, when I sit on the porch where we so often drank coffee together, I swear I can feel his presence, proud of me for being strong enough to do the right thing, even when it meant losing my sons forever.